Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be taking this tablecloth that I thrifted for $4 and turning it into something cute and fun to wear for summer. So originally when I picked up this fabric I was thinking what I should do with it, and I had kind of thought that I would use it as a lining for a jacket. It's kind of the nice weight for that. I like using something printed as a lining, so it's kind of like fun on the inside. Yeah, that's just kind of what I had in mind for it, but the more I looked at this fabric and the pattern on it, the more I just really liked it and thought it was really beautiful, and so I've decided that it deserves to be its own piece. And originally what I was thinking of doing with this fabric was a dress, but I did post on here and on Instagram as well a poll asking what I should make with it, and the top comment actually was a two-piece set for summer. And a lot of people actually recommended I think it's called the Saguaro set by Friday Pattern Company, which is like a short sleeve top and pants combination. But I think because I had originally planned to make a dress with this, and also just based on the pattern, I feel like if I did pants, it might look a little bit pajama-y. What I've decided to do is a like crop top and then a skirt. So if I wear them together, then it might kind of look like a dress, and then I can also wear them separately as well. So that is what we're gonna go with, and I'm really excited. I think that this is gonna be a really cute outfit for summer. It's the first day of summer today, so it's very appropriate, and we are expecting some nice warm weather towards the end of the week as well. So I'm very excited for that, and hopefully I can finish this up in time to wear it. In terms of patterns, I'm thinking that I'm just gonna kind of DIY it. The skirt is just going to be like a gathered rectangle basically with pockets, so I think that's pretty easy. I had looked at doing the peppermint pocket skirt, but the way that that pattern works is it has a front panel, a back panel, and then side panels with the pockets. And the side panels, because of the way that they are sewn, I guess they do take up a bit of fabric, probably more than if I were to do inseam pockets. And also just with 4 panels of a skirt instead of 2, I think it would be a lot harder to match this pattern. And I don't sew with a lot of prints, so I'm definitely not as experienced with doing pattern matching for my makes. So I think I'm just going to keep it nice and easy and just kind of sew 2 rectangles together, gather it with elastic at the waist, put some pockets in the side seam, and that will be the skirt. And then for the top, I've got a couple of options for the top pattern in mind, but I think what I'm going to do is start with the skirt to get that one finished out of the way, and then use kind of whatever leftover remaining fabric I have to go ahead and just kind of DIY the crop top, either using a pattern and hacking it or using a tutorial that's out there somewhere. I have about 2.25 meters of this fabric, and it's about 140 centimeters wide. So I think that should be enough to get a good length skirt and then just a little sleeveless crop top out of. And do the pattern matching as well. So I think that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm starting by laying out my freshly washed and dried fabric and giving it a good press to get all of the wrinkles out. And then for the skirt, I'm cutting 2 large rectangles that are the length I want the skirt to end up, plus some allowance for elastic and hemming. And I ended up cutting at about 80 centimeters long. However, I think I maybe should have gone a little bit longer, as we'll see later on, maybe more like 85 centimeters. And I'm cutting along the top layer first, and then the bottom layer to make sure that I'm cutting straight along the pattern. The woven print of this fabric makes it really easy to get a straight cut. So that was the first piece of the skirt, and now I'm cutting the second piece at the same length, and just making sure that I'm lining everything up and matching the pattern of the fabric so it will line up at the side seams. Then, since I had cut the skirt pieces the full width of the fabric, they were quite wide, so I ended up trimming off some of the edge. In the end, I had 2 rectangles that were about 80 centimeters long and 114 centimeters wide. And I will leave my measurements in the description box below so that you can easily see what kind of ease and size that ended up on me when you see the final result. I was able to squeeze the pockets out of the fabric that I trimmed off the width of the skirt, which was great. And I just used the pattern from the Style Arc Ethel pants because they're nice and big and a simple shape to sew. And I didn't need to worry too much about matching the pattern for these since they would be on the inside of the skirt and not visible. I always find choosing a thread color for patterned fabrics really difficult, and for this one I ended up going with this sort of dusty rose color, which seemed to blend in with a lot of the colors in the print really well. I started by finishing the outer edges of the pockets with my serger and then stitched them to the side seams of my skirt with the right sides together. And originally I was planning on sewing the elastic straight into the top of the skirt, so I used that to kind of gauge where the waistband would end up, and then place the pockets so that the top was about 17 centimeters down from the top of my fabric, which would have worked, except that my plan for the elastic didn't really pan out, which we'll see later on. Once the pocket pieces were attached at the sides of each skirt, I serged down the side seams so that all of the edges were nicely finished. Then I pressed the pocket pieces out away from the skirt and also understitched the pocket piece to the seam allowance on the skirt front, only to prevent it from turning out. Next, I assembled the skirt at the side seams, pinning them with right sides together, making sure that the pattern was all lined up, and then stitching down from the top, pivoting at the pocket and stitching around that edge, then pivoting back and stitching down the remaining length of the skirt. When pressing the side seam, I like to press it open, but then when I get to the pocket, I press it towards the front since that's the way that I want the pocket to hang, so that I can easily slip my hands in and out. And then the side seams of my skirt with the inseam pockets were complete. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I originally wanted to do the waistband by stitching the elastic directly to the top of the skirt, stretching it while sewing. So I cut a piece of my 38mm wide elastic to my waist size plus some seam allowance, but then I quickly realized that it was not going to stretch enough to the full width of the skirt. And I had also held the skirt up in front of the mirror and realized that if I folded over the top for the elastic waistband, then it was probably going to end up too short. So instead what I decided to do was make a separate waistband casing and attach that to the gathered top of the skirt. And this added a lot of steps to the process, but in the end I think it was the right call. But then before I went ahead and cut the waistband, I wanted to make sure that I had enough fabric left for the top, so I went ahead and cut that first. So for the top pattern, I decided to go with the Phoebe tank from fabricstore.com and just crop about 14 centimeters off the length of it. I was looking at some other cute sort of square-shaped crop tanks, however a lot of those needed a full facing and I wasn't going to have enough fabric left to do that, so I just decided to keep things simple. And just for reference, I'm cutting this pattern out in the size 8 to 10. And because at this point I had really limited fabric left and still wanted to cut out a waistband casing, I didn't worry too much about the pattern matching for the top, but I just kind of made sure that the side seams would be somewhat aligned when I stitched them together. One thing that I didn't really account for when matching the patterns was the seam allowance, so that's something that I'll try to remember to do for next time. Once I had the bodice pieces squared away, I used the leftover fabric to cut out the waistband casing. So I cut a long strip that was about 10 centimeters wide, which was twice the width of my elastic plus seam allowance, and a little bit longer than my total hip circumference so that I knew I could slide it up over my hips. Then I stitched the waistband together along the short edge with right sides together, pressed it in half lengthwise, and also pressed up one of the long edges by 1 centimeter so that it would be easier to stitch it down later on in the process. And before I could attach the waistband to the skirt, I first needed to gather the top of the skirt to the width of the waistband, So I sewed a row of long stitches along the top of each skirt side and then pulled the threads to gather them until they were the correct length. And then to secure my gathers, I always like to wrap the long threads around a pin in a sort of figure 8 or infinity symbol so that they don't come loose. Once my skirt was all gathered up, I pinned the waistband to the top with right sides together along the edge that I hadn't pressed up, and then stitched them together at my seam allowance. And I also made sure that the waistband seam was lined up to the center back of the skirt. Then I pressed the facing up and away from the skirt and towards the inside along the center fold, and tucked under that 1 centimeter that I had pressed up before. And I pinned along the seam from the right side, making sure that I was catching the waistband on the inside so that I could stitch in the ditch and enclose all of the raw edges in the waistband casing. I also left a gap at the back of the skirt so that I could feed my elastic through. And my elastic just squeezed into this casing. I probably should have added some more extra room, but thankfully it worked and I was able to get it threaded through the whole way. To secure the elastic, I overlapped it by the seam allowance and then stitched 2 rows of zigzag stitches. And then I was able to pin the gap in the waistband and stitch it closed using the same stitch in the ditch method as before. The final step was to hem the skirt, so I pressed up the bottom edge by 1 centimeter twice so that I could keep as much of the length of the skirt as possible, and then stitched close to the folded edge. And then the skirt portion of my set was done. After that, assembling the crop top was really straightforward, so I started by pinning the front and back pieces with right sides together, and then stitched down the shoulder and side seams. And then I finished the seam allowances with my serger and pressed them all towards the back of the top. Then I needed to make some bias tape to bind the neckline and armholes, so I lined up the scraps that I had left over on my cutting mat and used a quilting ruler and my rotary cutter to cut diagonal strips that were about 4 centimeters wide. And then I attached the strips at the ends to make one long continuous strip of bias tape, and pressed all of the seams open and then just trimmed the little triangles that were sticking out away to clean them up, and also folded the long strip in half and pressed it. And then I started pinning the tape along the edges on the right side of my top, trimming them down to size so that I could stitch them together along the short edges and have them be the exact length that I needed. I also made sure that the seam of the bias tape was at the center back of the top, although in this case it didn't really matter since it gets flipped to the inside, and also the bias tape was already seamed together multiple times in other places. But I just find that having the straight seam at the center back helps me tell which side is the back of the shirt when I go to put it on. So I stitched the bias tape to the neckline at a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance, and then I clipped into the curves and flipped the binding to the inside of the top, making sure to cover the raw edges of the fabric before stitching it down one last time. And I repeated all of those steps for each of the armholes as well. After that, the final step was to do the hem. So for the top, I pressed it up by first 1 centimeter and then again by about 2.5 centimeters, so it had a bit of a wider hem than the skirt. And then again, I stitched close to the inner folded edge to secure the hem, and after one final press, the top was complete. So here is the finished result, and I just styled it with some simple sandals. If I'm being completely honest, I don't think this one turned out exactly how I envisioned it. I think if I could go back and change some things, I would probably use less fabric for the skirt, because I think now that I've tried it on, it feels a bit full. Also, because I had to add the waistband casing, the pockets ended up a little bit too low. But other than that, I think it turned out pretty well. It's certainly comfortable, and I think I forgot to mention earlier that the tablecloth is 100% cotton, so I think that this is going to be a really nice set to keep cool in for summer. And like I said before, I can wear the skirt and top together like this or separate as well. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below and also what videos you'd like to see next. Also, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you'd like to see more like this from me in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.